There's a certain expectation, I suppose, on my behalf, and this might not be fair, that there are certain artists you might have heard of before ever you dream of taking an art history or art appreciation course. And one of those artists is Michelangelo. I mean, I bet Van Gogh and Picasso are some others, but I've always thought that Michelangelo is one of those art makers that people just inherently know, although this might not be true. He's born in 1475 to a middle class Florentine family. His father is a kind of a low level city administrator. Um, Michelangelo wants none of that middle class life, however. He wants to be a poor guy, and maybe not a poor guy, but he wants to be someone who works with his hands. And so he early on, while before he's 10, he goes and works in the Carrera marble quarry outside of Florence, where he learns to cut sheets of marble, not sculpt them, just cut them so they could be drug around and used by other sculptors. His father recognized that the kid's got a certain amount of talent, is eventually apprenticed to a pretty famous art maker in Florence named Ghirlandaio. And an apprenticeship at this time frame usually involved 7 years of training. During this time frame, the young artist would live and work with the master artist, and early on they would do the everyday boring kinds of things that real artists don't want to do but have to have done. So every day if I'm painting, I got to make paint, but my time's too important for that. Instead, I want you to go make paint. And I'll teach you how, but that way you can make my paint for me. And then as time goes on and you learn how to make paint, I will teach you how to prime a wall. And that will be the thing. And so usually what will happen is that a master artist will have 4 or 5 apprentices working with him during this time frame so that they can do the elementary steps, and kind of move through. So early on, you learn how to make paint, and then you learn how to prepare a wall, and then you learn how to transfer a cartoon, and then you learn how to finish a painting. And so at the end of the 7 year period, you submit a masterwork to the Guild of Saint Luke. He was the patron saint of painters, and the Guild of Saint Luke was the organization for paint for artists. And if the guild believed that you had developed enough skill, you were then created or acknowledged as a working artist, and then you could accept pupils yourself. And so early on, Michelangelo trains with a painter. Although he never feels much love for painting, he doesn't want to do it really much, very much. Um, it's kind of what we know him for today, although he did other stuff really well too. So our discussion today is going to primarily focus on his sculpture, because in an art like this, we can't do all of the artists and do all of their stuff. But I thought I would show you this drawing and this poem, because amongst other things, I mean, Michelangelo, he painted, he did architecture, he sculpted, he also wrote poetry, and his primary form of poetic expression was that of sonatas. And sonatas are really complicated things to write. They have a certain rhyme pattern, a certain meter pattern, and a length requirement in terms of like how they're formed. And so he did sonatas, and this is a drawing of him painting the Sistine Chapel. And I'll show you the Sistine Chapel. Before I took an art history class, I always had this idea that he was lying on his back on like a plank of wood, painting, and instead this shows him drawing standing up, painting standing up. And the poem actually is about how old he feels and how broken his body feels. And he was working on this, let me get the math right, in his late 30s. I mentioned to you he was born in 1475, so I'll let you do the math here. We kind of date these to right around 1490, which puts him about 17. This is the Madonna of the Stairs, and then a battle of the Lapis and the Centaurs. And we can see, even in these early works, some of the things that make Michelangelo's art so wonderfully expressive. And that is his remarkably keen attention to the form of the human body. It's an early expression here, but we will see it as we go along. This is a wooden crucifix that was discovered, I think, in the 1970s, and it was found in Santa Croce, which is the church where Michelangelo is buried and the church where he worshipped. And it dates from 1492. It's carved out of wood, and art historians now believe that this is a very early work by Michelangelo, and they believe it more from documentary evidence, contracts, than through stylistic reasons, because this Jesus looks a little bit different than some of the bodies that he will work on later. I mean, I'll show you this, for example, done about the time that he's, 21, 22. Um, and this is where he begins to take his expression of the male body, which is kind of muscled in a very deep and profound way. But these works essentially provided Michelangelo with an avenue to get increasingly wealthy patronage. And so far in our discussion of Italy so far, we have looked at work from Italy, or in Italy, from Florence and Siena. And we haven't yet got to that city to the south called Rome, but we will. Rome is kind of a secondary importance through the early part of the Renaissance. And it's during the end of the 15th and into the 16th century where Rome begins to overtake Florence as the primary city of Italy, not just in terms of culture or in terms of religion, because it always has been, right? The papacy has always been in Rome, and that was the center of the church. But in many ways, Florence was the cultural center of Italy. And that's a really important thing to remember. A tour guide I was speaking to recently sort of told me that the population of Rome during around 1500 was only 50,000 people. Florence was 4 times that. So Florence was the cultural center of Italy. Rome might have been the religious center, but it was Florence that was the social center. And in some ways, having spent some time in Poland, I can tell you that the governmental focus of a center of Poland is Krakow. The religious center is Częstochowa, and the social center is Krakow. So Warsaw for government, Częstochowa for religion, and Krakow for culture. That's going to change in Rome as more and more artists are going to flock there. And one of the popes decided they wanted Michelangelo to do a statue for St. Peter's. And he began this when he was 22 years old. This is his famous Pieta. It is right in the front of St. Peter's Church when you walk inside it. So when you walk in the front door of St. Peter's, if you walk in, I don't know, 50 feet, turn to your right, there it is. And this is a subject that was rare in Italian art. The picture of Mary, the depiction of Mary holding her crucified and dead son was pretty common in Germany throughout the Renaissance, both the early and now as this is in the high. But it was rare in Italy. And so Michelangelo is going out on a limb. And this is carved from one gigantic bit of solid marble. And in it, you have this youthful Mary gazing down at her dead son, although he's shown not so much as dead as, oh, I don't know, sleeping. His body does not look broken like we will see in some compositions. I mean, let me zoom ahead real quick, and I'll show you the kind of thing we'll look at in a little while when we look at Matthias Grunwald's Eisenheim altarpiece. I mean, that's a dead Christ. That's a woo, doesn't look so good kind of Jesus. This Mary, or this Jesus, looks as if he's napping on his mother's lap, or more than anything else. He's enormous, his languid body stretching across her chest. And one of the things you might not have noticed at first is that there is a sash going through her chest, kind of like a crossbody purse of sorts. And that gets us to a really interesting story. I don't know if the story is true, but I love it if it is. And if it is true, it shows a monumental shift in the role of the artist in the relationship between patron and creator. So the story goes something like this: that Michelangelo completed this. He's 24 years old, and this is his first really big deal. He had had some big deals before, but this was the big deal. This was the thing that he was convinced was going to make his fame. And so the object goes into a small side chapel of New St. Peter's. And I'll give you an idea. New St. Peter's is a pretty big church, and pretty big is kind of is code for it is enormous. This thing is absolutely huge. And in order to grasp it, you have to see a plan of it and maybe a picture of it as well, because that's it. This is the church, and it was placed in some little side chapel over here. I don't even know where. And Michelangelo was visiting it one day shortly after it had been unveiled, and he was justifiably proud of it. And he heard people asking, "Who made this? Do you know who made this?" And Michelangelo said, "Well, I made this." And so he had occasion to speak to the Pope, and he said, "Dear Holy Father, would it be possible to have a small card placed next to this object so that people can know it was I who made it?" And the Pope looked at Michelangelo like he was the most absurd of sinners. He's like, da 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 da, no no no, it's not about you, Bucko. It's about me. It's about the Holy Mother Church, and I, the person who is paid for it. You're not that important. You're just the artist. And Michelangelo was so offended by this that he snuck into St. Peter's and carved across her chest, "Michelangelo Buonarroti from Florence made this." And the from Florence part was particularly irksome to the Pope because he was a member of the Della Rovere family, and they were Romans. This idea that a Roman would be different from a Florentine is kind of lost on us, because we often don't have the same level of civic pride. And remember, Italy does not exist. There is no Italy. No one's Italian. They're a Florentine or a Paisan or a Neapolitan or a Paduan or a Venetian. Italy as a country is brand new. It's from the 19th century. And so Florence and Rome were very much rivals, and so too are the people who lived there. And the Pope, who had constant bickering with people from Florence, was aware of this too. And so Michelangelo, again, if this is true, is one of the first real examples of an art maker maybe being at least as important as his patron, even when his patron was the Pope. This was the beginning of Michelangelo, the great sculptor. And when you see it in person, it's big, it's enormous, and it's really quite lovely. When you go to Florence, and you should, you can go to the Piazza Pubblico, and you should, and there is a gigantic David on the outside of the Palazzo Pubblico. You should go see that one. It's big, but it's not the real one. It's actually a copy, because the real one itself is inside. And back in the day, you couldn't take pictures of it, but now you can. And so I wanted to talk about this structure. This is Michelangelo's David, carved in 1501, when Michelangelo is about 26 years old. It is a story from the Jewish Bible of the Jewish hero David, who with a slingshot fells Goliath and then approaches Goliath, cuts off Goliath's head with his own sword, and therefore saves the day for his Jewish people. This object is roughly 516 centimeters tall. That's 5.15 meters. That makes him over 18 feet. This thing is enormous, enormous. It's like bigger than you think it is. Like every time I go see this, I'm like, wow, That's big. And in the summer of 2019, I was in a side room of the Academia where this work is. And we had a tour guide who was talking about some clay model of some statue that was not Michelangelo's David. And I was standing next to one of the students who was with me on the trip, and she looked kind of bored, maybe a little sleepy. And so I gestured like, "Come follow me," because I knew what was in the next room. And so I showed her that, right? And this is from, I don't know how far away that is, pretty far away. And we peeked our head in there. And I wish I had a picture of her head because she was looking at this, I was looking at her, and the face on her, the look on her face was one of, oh my goodness. It's like when you look at this, it doesn't look big, but you see it like that and you're like, wow, that's enormous. So I call your attention to the what we see here. Do you think there's anyone this guy could not defeat? I mean, when we talk about David and Goliath, the reason why, well, I'll ask you, how did David defeat Goliath? And if David is this guy, the answer is pretty clear. David defeated Goliath because he's got that body. But let me show you an earlier representation of Goliath. How about this one? This is an earlier representation of Goliath by another one of our Ninja Turtles by the name of Donatello. We don't know exactly when this was made, but 1430 is a safe bet. So look at this Goliath. Look at this David. And I ask you, how did this David beat the Goliath? And the answer is clear. This David beat Goliath through the power of God. The only possible explanation that that young man could kill that beast was because God was willing it. And this is a totally different representation of David. If I had this David's body, you know what I would do? I would go around every grocery store and open up every jar of pickles because no jar of pickles would be able to withstand the force of my grip. This is perhaps the most perfect male body ever in the history of perfect male bodies. Like, look at those shoulders, those pecs, those abs. Look at those forearms. Look at those legs. My goodness, this is the ideal male body. And not only that, and I'm going to rotate back and forth between pictures of the inside and pictures of the one on the outside. But not only that, but he is giving you the death glare. This was the glare my dad gave me when he wanted me to do something and I didn't want to do it. I did it very quickly, but I didn't want to do it. He's staring off, and we are at the before moment. It's kind of hard to make out, but this is the slingshot draped over his shoulder, and in this hand are the rocks that he was going to use to defeat Goliath. The hands, when you see them, are clearly far bigger than they should be given the size of the man, but they're shown bigger for a couple of reasons. One, the hands are part of the reason for Goliath's downfall, right? Like he's not going to do it with a gun. He's going to use his hands with the rocks and the slingshot. But then secondly, originally, this object was meant to be seen from below. That you were looking up at this, and through the viewing angle that you were going to get, the hands were going to be foreshortened. And so as a way of optically correcting that, Michelangelo wanted to make those hands bigger. But even still, it works out just fine. Michelangelo has in part based this object on a statue that he loved, a statue in the Vatican called the Apollo Belvedere. As a matter of fact, David's face, in some ways, is based upon the Apollo Belvedere. I mean, the Apollo here has the top knot, but the face in many ways looks familiar. Now, this object is an important one because David, well, he symbolizes the unlikely defeat of tyranny, right? What is Goliath but a bully? Right? Goliath's a big bully. He beats up people because he's bigger than them, and every now and again, a bully gets knocked from their horse. And in this instance, it happens because of the power of God, but it symbolizes the defeat of the little guy over the man, the big bad guy. And Florence, during this time frame, was overcoming their own sort of tyranny. And this object very much symbolizes that. So the David is one of those objects that that cemented Michelangelo's position as one of the great sculptors. And he was never quite done doing that. And I'll show you another one of his statues in a second. But let's compare these two objects because they're both David's. So it's the exact same subject matter, and they're done within a lifetime of one another, right? Like 70 years isn't that long. It's, again, almost the life of my mother. And so we have two different works. This is enormous. This is the size of a hobbit. This is carved from marble, a gigantic piece of marble that people were scared was because it was flawed, that it wasn't going to be able to be carved into anything, but it's been carved, and this is cast. It's cast from bronze. And one of them we have this David all nude, wearing boots and a hat. There's nothing. With this object, it's been shown after. And the reason why we know it's after is that we have him holding Goliath's sword and he's standing on Goliath's head. In this instance, it's before. It's before because he's still focusing. He's got that death stare and he's holding the rocks and he's got the slingshot over him. And then we could also talk about the ways in which the male body has been rendered. I don't think it's inadequate to say that Michelangelo's David is perhaps, well, it's the new Polykleitos, isn't it? If Polykleitos' Doryphorus was the canon, this was the perfect body, I would suggest that this isn't far away. And that's a really, really important idea. And so we have two different renderings. This is an adolescent boy. This is not just a man, but a perfect man. So same subject, but it's so different. Let me show you another Michelangelo sculpture, and then we'll do some paintings in a hurry. This is a really fabulous work called the Bruges Madonna, done about the same time frame. And as a matter of fact, this was the only Michelangelo sculpture to leave Italy during Michelangelo's own lifetime. To be fair, Michelangelo lives a very long life. I think he lives into his 90s, certainly. But this is in Bruges. And so when you go to Belgium, and you should, and you can have waffle and chocolate and beer and fries. That's all you need. Go into the cathedral in Bruges and you will see this. It's this really lovely statue of Mary and a little baby Jesus. It's set into this kind of ridiculous Baroque niche. But it is just a really fabulous statue, and it shows almost the same Mary, this peaceful look upon her face, and this really human infant Christ, like toddler Christ. And again, I'm constantly thinking about the postcard picture. So this is the statue, and that was behind me at the same time I was taking them. And so hooray for all of that. Let's do some Michelangelo paintings, because if I didn't, the art history gods would smite me and I would not be allowed to teach art history anymore. And so I'll give you a very early Michelangelo painting. This is what's called the Doni Madonna. It's in the Uffizi in Florence, and it was commissioned by a Florentine banker. And it shows Mary, Joseph, and Christ. And you know what? Let me try to make this a little bit bigger, just so you can see it. Can I make a confession to you? I want Mary's arms. Those are not the typical lady arms. Those are Michelle Obama's arms. Those are muscled arms. That's a I can beat you in arm wrestling kind of arm. To say nothing of little baby Jesus, who looks like he's been working out himself. This early on, when Michelangelo is in still his formative years is him figuring out the human body. And one of the things Michelangelo does is give people muscles. Clearly, that's the case that Michelangelo has muscles. But even in painting and even in women, he's interested in muscling them up. So I give you here a picture of a building attached to the Vatican. This is the Sistine Chapel. And I took this photograph from the dome of St. Peter's. And I wonder if I have a better picture of the view from St. Peter's. I doubt it. But but it's a small little private chapel for the Pope now. It's part of the Vatican apartments. And so this is a view of St. Peter's Square from the top of the dome. And to give you an idea, the Sistine Chapel is right over here. It's not quite it, but it's close enough. And so the Sistine Chapel was constructed during the reign of Pope Sixtus. That's why it's called the Sistine Chapel. And early on, it had some paintings in the ceiling. They were blue with gold stars. And a number of art makers, Perugino, Botticelli, and others, painted these large-scale paintings of the life of Christ and the life of Moses along the walls. But as time went on, a new pope, Pope Julius II, wanted some different paintings in there. And so he commissioned Michelangelo to do two different paintings. He does the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel from 1508 to 1512, and the Last Judgment here along the back wall. And if I'm not mistaken, that's 1536 to 1541. The paintings here were done between 1481 and 1483. So let's look at the ceiling, because this is one of the real monuments in the history of Western art. Renaissance art, no doubt. Western art, certainly. And as you enter the space, you see time unfold before you, from the separation of light and darkness, the creation of the sun, moon, and earth, the moving of the waters, the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve. This is the temptation and the fall, and then the expulsion, right? So here they're getting kicked out. Then we have the sacrifice of Noah, the great flood, and then the drunkenness of Noah. This was all painted by Michelangelo on the ceiling vault over the course of 4 years. It is, unsurprisingly, a fresco. And this is the most famous scene from all of that. It is the creation of Adam. It shows what looks to be this David, right? This muscled guy reaching out almost as if, like right now, he's just a ball of clay, that he doesn't yet have the spark of life in him. And God is reaching out here, sort of in this kind of like odd shape here, which kind of reminds me of like the cross section of a human brain surrounded by angels. And this woman here, people think she might be either the Virgin Mary or Eve, and God reaching out towards this hand. And you have to imagine it, but I'll give it to you, that he's zapped Adam into life, that the moment beforehand he was just organic material, but God gives him life, gives him spirit, gives him air, and thereby changing everything. Adam has been painted sort of on this frescoed green hillside, and the blue here, all of this clearly a fresco. And I wanted to show you some of the cool things about this, because there are some sketches that survive for all of this. So this is a sketch of one of the female figures here. Again, that is the back of a long distance rower holding up this book, and you can see Michelangelo drawing everything from a detail of her face to her toes there. Another female figure, and you can sort of see the ways in which he muscles them up. And another thing I wanted to show you was this. Now, the Sistine Chapel, again, was sort of a private worship space for the Pope. Now it's filled with 10,000 people every day. This is part of the Vatican Museum, and when I was there on July 4th, actually, of 2019, and speaking with one of the guys who's a tour guide there, he said that the day before the 3rd of July, they had 42,000 people come through the Vatican Museum. Now, this is in the high point of um, of tourism season, but I bet of the 42,000 who go through the Vatican Museum, 98% of them make their way to the Sistine Chapel, which means this is a remarkably filled space with people who are all sneaking bad pictures, even though you're not supposed to. But back in the day, it was filled with candles. And candles do something when you extinguish them. And you might not have thought about this, but you've seen it already because I showed it to you. Remember when we looked at the Merode altarpiece and I said something happens when you blow out a candle? And that something is, if I can find it, candles, right? Candle smoke. That smoke carries upwards soot, right? The impurities in the wax of the candle. And although it might seem small, over the course of hundreds of years and thousands of candles, that soot will rise up to the roof and make the painting dirty. But because it's a fresco, and you know it's a fresco, that dirt is on the wall, but the pigment is in the wall. And so in the 1980s, funded by the National Japanese Television station, the Sistine Chapel was cleaned. First the ceiling, and then the back wall. And so people's understanding of Michelangelo fundamentally changed because they thought he was dark, and then they cleaned it, and they thought, wow, it was light. And when you go to the Sistine Chapel now, you will see that there are places that they deliberately left dirty so as to remind people as to what it once was. And here's one of those spots. See that dark spot there? That's an unclean spot. Now we've already looked at the Last Judgment, so I just want to show you some details as a way of thinking about this as a really nice capstone to Michelangelo's painting career. He does other stuff later, but this is sort of the masterpiece of his later career, and that is the bodies that Michelangelo begins to paint become almost muscled, like his muscles have muscles, and this Christ is one of them, right? This beardless Christ, arm raised in judgment, glaring down. You just look at his abdominal wall, and it's just kind of bizarre. So these figures all have muscles. And one of the things that's sort of sad about Michelangelo is he was convinced of his own damnation. He led a complicated life. He thought he wasn't worthy of grace. And this image here, taken from just beneath Christ, is an image of Saint Bartholomew. Sometimes martyrs are shown with the implement of their martyrdom, and Saint Bartholomew was skinned alive. He was flayed with a knife. And so here you can see that knife, and here you can see him holding the skin that came off of him. And Michelangelo painted his own self-portrait on that, convinced that he was going to burn in hell. And so Michelangelo had a troubled end. And over here, I just think this is kind of funny because in the boat, the Acheron, which takes people across the river Styx, Michelangelo painted the portrait of this devilish guy. Um, he painted the portrait of one of the Pope's assistants on him. They didn't get along, and don't mess with an art maker who's got a very talented paintbrush because they will do bad things for you. And so this was that guy's name. His name escapes me, but there he is. It shows the Pope's one of the Pope's assistants, and another is this guy over here. Michelangelo was an art maker, and he's an art maker that very much reaffirms the idea that art is an intellectual activity and not a physical activity. Because Michelangelo could paint, he could sculpt, he could design buildings, all of which he did. I mean, I'll just show you very briefly a courtyard he designed. So this was a building he designed that building, designed this building, and then designed the courtyard for it. As a matter of fact, this is on the 50-cent Italian euro coin. Um, Michelangelo could do anything he wanted to because art for him wasn't necessarily an intellectual, a physical activity. It was an intellectual idea. And again, in the courtyard here is the Marcus Aurelius that we looked at last time. Michelangelo changes the art world, and one of the things we'll look at in the course of all of this is the ways in which some art makers that follow him in the 1930s begin to do weird stuff. They begin to paint in the manner of Michelangelo. And the artists who follow him, who embrace that style, this very unusual proportions of the human body, we call those artists mannerists. The mannerists are coming up next.